program, just me and the mic, and whoever's in the studio watching along with me. Genesis chapter 23 and chapter 24. We're going to talk about a funeral and a wedding tonight. Kind of interesting, the ending of the last two chapters, chapter 21 and chapter 22, come into play as far as these two chapters coming up. But we'll touch on that in just a couple of minutes and see what's there. Not sure if this class will finish up tonight on this lesson, and if not, you know me, I will take it over into next week. No problem at all with that. And then after that, we should have just one more lesson left in the study of the life and times of Abraham. Someone said that there are more than 31,000 verses in the Bible. And 2 Timothy 3 and verse 16 tells us that every one of them are comprised of God-breathed words. They're all inspired of God. And they're all profitable for our lives. And it's kind of interesting because that includes a verse like chapter 21 and verse 33. It says, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham lived as an alien, verse 24 says, in the land of the Philistines for many days. You know, when you first look at it, it looks kind of like a couple of throwaway verses, just something in passing going on from there. And if you have ever looked at a map of the Bible lands and anything about where Beersheba is, there's nothing there but a lot of rocks and sand. A lot like New Mexico is. And yet Abraham plants a tamarisk tree there. It's the only mention in the Bible of Abraham ever planting anything. And the question would come up, why did he plant such a tree? And some people have said, well, it was to celebrate in Abraham's life a monument to declare all that God had done for him, all the provisions. It represented the everlasting God who had blessed him with a child, a treaty, a water supply, a permanent memorial. Yeah, but why out there? I don't know. And when you think about it some more and read a little bit on it, maybe it was because of not only what God had done, but what God was going to do for him. I don't know much about this kind of a tree. It's called a salt cedar tree here in the southwest United States. But I'm told it only grows something like an inch or two a year. And so for it to grow to its full height would take a long, long time. And maybe it's a memorial because God's going to He's going to bring Abraham's people back in 400 years, and maybe they would know something about that tree and what it represented. So, I don't know. But I do know this. Chapter 22, we talked about Mount Moriah and Abraham going up there to sacrifice his son as God had told him to do. There's outlines back there in the back seat, I think, Mike. Follow along with the class if you want to and jot down a note or two here and there. But when Abraham descends Mount Moriah with his son Isaac, I wonder, first of all, what that was like. You know, did they come down arm in arm and, you know, just tears of joy and celebrating what had happened? I don't know. But the other thing is, when they came down that mountain, Abraham still has 50 years of life before him, before he passes away. And of those 50 years, there are 25 years that passed by and we don't know anything about them. And whatever happened, it seemed like it just kind of went by smoothly, and and quietly, if you will. F.B. Meyer wrote and said, "The river of Abraham's life had passed the rapids and narrows of its earlier course, and now broadened into reaches of still water, and its current glided with an almost imperceptible movement." I really wish I could talk like that, Jim. I wish I could write those kind of words. That's pretty neat. But when all is said and done, the time goes by and you stop and ask, like we do, where did the time go? Where did the time go? The point is, they're living out their simple patriarchal life, tending flocks, watching over the herds. Within the clan, you've got births, marriages, deaths, all those different things going on. But always, always, there's worship of God. That never ceased. And maybe if we could live like they did with those days, always being constantly involved with that, we'd have more to say when we want to look back on the good old days. But anyway, one of the things that stood out to me as I prepared this and looked at some of this is how close the members of Abraham's household were to one another, what they meant to each other. And they grow together a lot like somebody said, trees in a dense forest. They grow, they intermingle with their branches and things. And you just can't separate them. And that's the way it should be with God's people. We grow together that way. We're getting any more to where we can hardly find time for each other and don't spend a lot of time with one another. And I think we're missing out. I think we're missing out. But somewhere along the line here, we get to the point of understanding that Sarah dies. Somebody had gall enough to suggest that they weren't even living together when Sarah passed away, because it leaves Abraham and Beersheba at the end of chapter 22, and it says she's in Kiriath Arba, in 23 and verse 1, in Hebron. And they actually suggested, says she was mad at him for not telling her all about what he was going to do, going to Mount Moriah to offer Isaac as a sacrifice and so forth. And when you start doing that kind of guesswork in the Bible, you can get in a lot of trouble. And this person, I think, got in a lot of trouble because there was a lot of ignorance involved in that speculation. If you notice what's stated here, when Sarah passes away, the loss of a loved one meant a lot to them. Losing a loved one, a familiar face, who's been around for so long with you, leaves a glaring blank that can never be filled again. It brings a stress. My experience and people I've talked to, but I think that was true for Abraham as well. Sarah, beautiful, basically a quiet-natured lady, and when she died, it left an incredible hole in the life of Abraham. We're also going to look a little bit at a marriage that takes place here, and that was not done in a flippant way. It was never done lightly. It was a serious business. And to have God's blessing for them meant so much that they didn't dare enter into a marriage lightly. It wasn't a matter of sentiment, but God's purpose for the family. And in this case, not only what it means for Abraham's family, but for all of his descendants and all of humanity for the centuries to come. It was a bigger meaning to what's coming up with this marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. You could definitely say it wasn't entered into hastily or without due consideration. And yet the way it takes place, you almost think maybe it did, but it really didn't. And we'll look at that when we get into chapter 24. Chapter 23, and it's a long chapter. It's got quite a bit. And how much we can read and how much we can go through on, well, no, it's not really that long of a chapter. only 19, 20 verses. We could do that. I was thinking of chapter 24. It's a lot longer. Chapter 23, beautiful, beautiful chapter. I want you to notice the wording on what's said. Now, Sarah lived 127 years. These were all the years of her life. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham got up from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites, another translation. I am an alien residing among you. Give me burial property among you so that I can bury my dead. Sarah dies at 127 years of age. She's the only woman I know of in the Bible who's mentioned with her age attached when she passed away. But stop and think about some other things. She's 127 years old when she died. She and Abraham were most likely married over 100 years. That's a long time. She married most likely as a teen. And even for most adults, death is usually considered, that's going to be sometime remote in the future. It's hard to put ourselves in the place of Abraham and think about what happened here. But here's one of the main things you can get. There was hardly ever a time in Abraham's life when Sarah was not his wife, was not with him. I've had the privilege of knowing some couples in the church who were married over 70 years. There were two couples, Jim, over at Netherwood. One of them, the Akers, were married 74 years. 74 years. And when the wife passed away first, it was a few months later he passed. That's not unusual. They've been married that long and been together that long, and when one leaves, what's the use of being around? It drains them. It takes away from them. Absolutely incredible to think of being married. Sometimes there are couples say it feels like we've been married 150 years, but that's for a different reason. But think about all the things that Abraham and Sarah had experienced together. They left their original home in Ur of the Chaldees. And then many years later, they left another home in Haran where they had lived for a while. Some people actually enjoy living in new places. It's exciting, But in those days especially, it meant you're moving, in this case, they're moving a long way off, and you're probably never going to see any family members again. I think when a couple who really loves one another and they're serving God, they draw closer together. They're the better for it. As I was putting this together, I was thinking about Jay and Pam Cook and their children who are missionaries in Turkey. And they haven't seen them for a couple of years or so.
How far was Haran from Nineveh?
Haran from Nineveh? I'm not really sure. I haven't really looked at a map to kind of gauge. It's a lot farther than I'm going to travel. A lot farther than I'm able to travel these days. But I think about Jay and Pam and their family and not being able to see them, especially the grandchildren. The changes when you do get to see them, it seems like they've grown so much, so fast. It's incredible. Think about the memories that Abraham and Sarah shared. It must have been kind of interesting to think back on the couple of times when she tried to pass as his sister. with Pharaoh and with Abimelech. Maybe they even laughed about it a little bit years after it happened, but I don't think they found it too funny at the time it occurred. And I think there were times when over and over they recounted how incredible God's amazing acts had been in their life, especially with Isaac. Those years pass, and they're going to be passing the torch on pretty soon in the next chapter to Isaac himself. The interesting thing here about this chapter, you and I tend to get involved in some of the sentiment of the bereavement and things that are going on. The Bible doesn't dwell on the personal bereavement of Abraham that much. All it says was he went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. But those are strong words. We'll come back and look at those in a little bit. The big part of the text deals with the funeral arrangements and what's going on, because it's more than just family. With what's going to take place where she's going to be buried, her passing needs to be known, recognized, and revered, at least from a Jewish point of view, and for the descendants of Abraham after that. It's not a typical funeral story. I understand that even in the Muslim religion, in Islam, they also have a point of remembering Sarah's grave and its location, because Abraham and Sarah are key figures in their religious views. From a Jewish historical perspective, though, her grave needs to be known, recognized, but only if Abraham buys the land. Only if he owns the title deeds and establishes a family tomb for posterity. So you get that brought out, but the word, he didn't just mourn for her, he wept for her. And the word for weep there means strong crying. And if you know anything about bereavement in that part of the world, they really get into it. They really get into their wailing and the crying and weeping and mourning. It's something so deeply personal for them.
What should we remember that Isaac did?
There are several things you could remember that Isaac did. I'm only going to touch on a couple of them as they have a bearing on this, and we'll look more at that when we get into chapter 24. But it's really interesting when you stop and look at the marriage arrangement that takes place. But going back here, I want you to notice the funeral arrangements, what takes place here. In verse 3, Abraham speaks to the Hittites and he says, I'm an alien residing among you. Give me burial property among you so that I can bury my dead. And they replied to Abraham, listen to us, my Lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in our finest burial place. None of us will withhold from you this burial place for burying your dead. Pick the best of the best. Abraham rose and bowed down to the Hittites, the people of the land. He said to them, that's another nice study in itself, just the Hittites and where they are at this time and where they came from. He said to them, if you are willing for me to bury my dead, listen to me, and ask Ephraim, the son of Zohar, on my behalf, to give me the cave of Machpelah that belongs to him. It's at the end of his field. Let him give it to me in your presence for the full price as burial property. Ephraim was sitting among the Hittites. So in the hearing of all the Hittites who came to the gate of his city, Ephraim the Hittite answered Abraham, no, my Lord, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the sight of my people. Bury your dead. That's incredibly generous of him. Abraham bowed down to the people of the land and said to Ephraim in the hearing of the people of the land, listen to me if you please. Let me pay the price of the field. Accept it from me, and let me bury my dead there. Ephraim answered Abraham and said to him, My Lord, listen to me. Land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. One of the interesting things here is the bartering process that's going on. And in the Middle East, they're known for that. Well, all through the Mediterranean in the Middle East, they do that. Bury your dead. Abraham agreed with Ephron. Abraham weighed out to Ephron the silver that he had agreed to in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 standard shekels of silver. So Ephron's field at the Machpelah near Mamre, the field with its cave and all the trees anywhere within the boundaries of the field, became Abraham's possession in the sight of all the Hittites who came to the gate of his city. It's kind of interesting, Mamre's mentioned. The oaks of Mamre, and that's where Abraham had built an altar to worship God. So he's asking for a burial place close to where it was known he worshiped God at this altar. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave of the field of Machpelah near Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field with its cave passed from the Hittites to Abraham as burial property. There's a lot of stuff that's interesting here in this. When you go through, you notice the burial arrangements, the bartering that goes on. The Hittites were kind of considered natives by this time. They'd been there for a long time. But Abraham describes himself as being a stranger and a sojourner or an alien among them. He's got the weaker part of the bargaining power. He's at a disadvantage, and so he has to appeal to them in this way. But they recognize him as being a mighty prince among them. And I'm told that was a pretty serious thing for them to recognize him that way. You know, they probably heard about his battles over the 5 kings some years earlier when they had taken Lot captive. He's probably been known from Beersheba to Damascus in his exploits and what he had done. He's probably been known for his wealth. He's a very wealthy man with all of his herds, the big clan that he has that follows him and he takes care of. But he's also known as a man who worships God, and it's a God different from their gods. So bury your dead in the choicest of our sepulchres, they tell him in verse 6. The burial chamber, he's offered anyone he wants, but he doesn't want one among them. He wants one at the end of the field that belongs to Ephraim, where the cave of Machpelah is, and is close to Mamre. He's prepared to pay the full price because he wants a grave that's distinct and removed from his neighbors. Excuse me. And so wanting that puts him in a whole different point of view. But they acknowledge him as that. And so the burial chamber is, it's bargained for. We'll give it to you. No, I'm going to pay for it. Well, and it's kind of interesting, Ephraim brings up the amount of what it's worth. You know, it is worth 400 shekels of silver. And Abraham doesn't bat an eye. He pays the money over. He's got the money. It's worth it to him, but there's a bigger picture involved for him. All this is done pretty close to the city of Hebron, village or little town, whatever it is. Today I understand there's a mosque there that Muslims have built. And it actually is supposed to mark the site where Abraham and his family are. And from what I can tell, what I've read, there's probably close to some authentication in where it's at. It's an authentic place. But anyway, they go through the bargaining point. It's a diplomatic way of bargaining for all of this stuff. Abraham's grieving, and there are a lot of people who say, well, you know, Ephraim probably took advantage of his grieving. He might have. He might have. But Abraham insists on paying for it anyway. and he's going to buy this field. It's kind of interesting because he could have said, knowing what I know, God's given me all this land anyway, so yeah, I'll just take it. But he doesn't do that. With the people around him, it's a matter of honor. He's establishing something. It's got far-reaching effects all down through the centuries. For all the Jewish people, when they're going to come back and live in the land and everything else that goes with that. Somebody said it, Ephraim probably came out well in the deal, and he probably enjoyed telling stories, about how this naive Abraham was taken for his money. But the location of Sarah's grave is going to be assured. And every time that story is told, it's even more assured. Yeah, she's buried right over there. And so it's anchored down. It was an important thing. But consider, secondly, the effect of her death. And it has an effect in 3 or 4 areas with people. One is with Abraham, his tears. And I told you already that, the words that are used there, he mourned her and he wept for her. The price to pay for her burial sepulcher wasn't too big, because it's not going to be just for her. It's going to involve his whole family. And later on, as you read through the history there in Genesis, it's going to involve not only Sarah, but then Abraham, later on Isaac and his wife, later on Jacob, Leah, down even to Joseph, hundreds of years later. The mourning process might have included shaving his head, tearing his clothes. I mean, they really get into it over there. But just try to imagine the loss of a spouse with whom you've lived for so many decades. That has to be one of the most touching things that took place. The Bible never talks to us about Abraham and Sarah in a romantic way as far as their love. He respects her, he defers to her on several occasions. Later on, Peter's going to tell us that she called Abraham Lord. I was counseling with a couple one time, and the guy said, tell her, she's to do like Abraham's wife Sarah. Sarah called Abraham Lord. She's supposed to call me Lord. And I said, well, based on what I know about you, Abraham earned it. You haven't yet. So don't hold your breath waiting for her to do that. When the woman dies, it's the only link to the home of his childhood. She's the only one who can talk with any knowledge about Terah, Nahor, Haran, of the Chaldees. The main events of her life, if you put them down in a nutshell, she marries her half-brother Abraham in chapter 11. She's barren in chapter 11. She moves to Canaan in chapter 12. She's abducted by Pharaoh in chapter 12. She gives Hagar to Abraham in chapter 16. She then abuses Hagar in chapter 16. Has her name changed by God from Sarai to Sarah, because God promised she'll be the mother of nations, chapter 17. She laughs at the promise in chapter 18. Can you imagine laughing at God when he makes a promise to you? I can't even imagine what that would be like, but she didn't know who he was. Later on, she's abducted by Abimelech. Finally, she gives birth to Isaac, drives away Hagar and Ishmael, and now she dies and she's buried. They had shared so much for so long together. He remembers her as a bright young wife, his fellow pilgrim. I think in a lot of ways she's the epitome of the traditional wedding vows we talk about. For better or for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. The New Testament reflects on her in only 2 passages. One of them is 1 Peter 3, verse 5 and 6. and the other one's in Hebrews 11, verse 11. Along with Abraham's tears, consider Abraham's confession in verse 3 and 4. When you go back there and look at what he's saying, I am an alien residing among you. Give me burial property among you. Great, wealthy patriarch, chieftain of a mighty clan. He's the owner of the promised land, but yet he's a sojourner and a pilgrim in this world. He's been in the land for something like 62 years, and he's still a newcomer to the land. And the Rio Rancho. Wow. Years ago, Vicki and I stayed at the home of a couple in southwestern Arkansas who helping with a gospel meeting there. The lady in that couple was from southeastern Arkansas, and she'd been living there for 24 years with this man. They'd been married that long, and she was still considered a newcomer by then. So here's Abraham, 62 years later, and he's still a sojourner and a pilgrim in this land. He's not he's not a voting resident yet, I guess. In a lot of ways, he's settled and naturalized, but at the same time, in their way of thinking, he's still a sojourner, or at least the way he thinks of himself. The word sojourner and alien or pilgrim, depending on which translation you use, they're never forgotten by him and his children. And by children, I mean all the way down through the Jewish nation. Leviticus 25 and verse 23, for example, says, the land is not to be permanently sold because it is mine, and you are only aliens and temporary residents in my land. That's God telling the people. The New Living Translation says, the land must never be sold on a permanent basis, for the land belongs to me. You are only foreigners and tenant farmers working for me. The Jews in the land, that's the way it was viewed by them, because that's the way God viewed it. In 1 Chronicles 29, verses 14 and 15, David and his people are making preparations to build a temple. And David said, but who am I? Who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this? For everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your own hand. Think about that with your giving Sunday. You only give back to God what has come from his hand in the first place. For we are aliens and temporary residents in your presence, as were all our ancestors. Our days on earth are like a shadow without hope. In Psalm 39 and verse 12, it says, hear my prayer, O Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not be silent at my tears, for I am here with you as an alien, a temporary resident, like all my ancestors. And in Hebrews 11 and verse 13, the writers reminding the Christians, these all died in faith, although they had not received the things that were promised. But they saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents on the earth. And again, the New Living Translation says about that, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They didn't receive the things that promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting they were foreigners and strangers on the earth. On the earth. You know, I get the idea that if we lived every day like that, remembering, I don't care how much you call yourself an American citizen or this or that. If you're a Christian, you don't belong here. There's someplace better. The question I had to ask was, what motivated that spirit? What's the motivation for thinking that way? And Hebrews 11 verse 14 says, those who say such things make it clear they are seeking a homeland. In other words, they hadn't found it here, and they're not going to find it here. It's elsewhere beyond this world. Abraham was uprooted from the land of his birth, and he could never take root again in any earthly country. One of the phrases I've heard people say, depending on where you go, if they really love their home state or a certain area, this is God's country. I think it always reflects something about our estimation of an earthly location. But for a Christian, well, in one sense, it's all God's country, isn't it? In another sense, now none of it is really, compared to where we're going, compared to what's waiting for us. We're headed to a country that's better, it's more beautiful than any place on this earth that you've ever been to. I've been to some amazing places, seen some incredible things in this world. Nothing like heaven. One writer said his spirit was always on the alert, eagerly reaching out toward the city of God, the home where only such royal souls as his can meet their peers and find their rest. If you ever think you're going to find rest on this earth, you've missed the point of Christianity. There's no rest for us here. Abraham refused to be content with anything less than the goal of that city that God had in mind for him. No wonder God was not ashamed to call him his God. Looking for a heavenly city, we sing about it, we'll talk about it, we'll ponder about it. But notice how much we take a lot of care to be comfortable in this world. We're not ill at ease like we like to think we are. We say, well, we count all things but loss. All to Jesus we surrender. But we get pretty interested in all the comforts of this creature life here in this world. I think our lifestyle tells a commentary on what we really think of our words and songs and how much we apply. That's just my point. Consider Abraham's faith. Look at how the people like to bury their dead, read their headstones. One of the coolest things was somebody put me onto this years ago, and I was going to look up a bunch of them. I got sidetracked, and I thought it's better if I don't have them because I'll get a whole bunch that I won't have time. But I've seen things on there like there was one friend of ours who passed away a few years ago, and on her headstone, it's got a picture of what she held dear. A pair of shoes and a purse she loved to shop. And that's okay. I've seen others where, somebody put on their headstone and said, I told you I was sick. Things like that. But it's the ones who speak to a relationship with God that get my attention. One of them had on there, coming, Father. Another one was gone home. Those are the people who have some kind of understanding. The graves of past generations are the heritage of our posterity. I believe that. Certain religions encourage pilgrimages. We talk about visiting the Holy Lands. The Holy Lands are where God's people are. That's what makes them holy, because the Spirit's there among them. Abraham was not going to take his wife's remains back to Haran or to Ur, where family members were and been buried there. Those lands had no claim on him now. The only fitting place was where he'd been a stranger and where one day his descendants would live. And still later, wherever his spiritual descendants would lie all across the world like the sands of the seashore. But it's fitting for him to bury Sarah in the land God had given them. Because where she's buried, where he will be buried, it's a nucleus where all the rest of the family will be buried, so that all their descendants will know this is our land. Abraham believed that. I think that may be one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why he refused to just take the land as a gift. So here he buries Sarah. There, Isaac and Ishmael are going to bury him. Then they're going to bury Isaac and Rebekah there. Jacob is going to bury Leah. Joseph would come all the way back from Egypt and bury his father there. Later, they would bring the bones of Joseph when they leave Egypt. Bring him back and bury him. Man, there's a lesson there. I wish I was doing that one on Joseph. They never buried his body in Egypt. They kept it up there where they could walk by and see his bones every day. One of these days, we're going home. And he said, you take my bones with you. And you bury them at home. Absolutely incredible stories. But I'm even more blown away by thinking, for some 3,000 years, longer than that really, their bones have lain in the ground, awaiting a coming day of resurrection, when they're going to be gathered up to that city that Abraham lived and died longing for. Isn't it interesting in the New Testament? The rich man and Lazarus, and where Lazarus is dwelling, in Abraham's bosom. There's a big study on life after death. I believe that paradise, heaven, Abraham's bosom are all the same place. They're all the same place. And when a Christian dies, the soul and spirit go back to God who gave it. The body lays in the ground. Resurrection is just bringing all three together. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, I want you to be preserved complete, body, soul, and spirit. And as long as you have those separated, you're not complete. Resurrection will do that and then take us home forever. Absolutely incredible. Chapter 24. If you notice on your outline sheet, I call it A Marriage Made in Heaven. I couldn't think of anything better to title it. That's exactly what it is. It's a marriage made in heaven. Because God said, here's what I want. Told Abraham, this is where you get a wife for Isaac from. So the instruction came from heaven. They did everything according to the word of God, who spoke from heaven. They did everything to please God, who was in heaven, by that marriage. And so there it is. There are 67 verses in this chapter. And I'm not going to try to go through all of them, but I will touch on some of them. Look at chapter 24, beginning verse 1. Look at the divine summons. Abraham was now old, I guess so, getting on in years. And the Lord had blessed him in everything. Abraham said to his servant, the elder of his household, who managed all he owned, place your hand under my thigh, and I will have you swear by the Lord God of heaven and God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live. Yeah, but they're good people, aren't they? I mean, they were created in God's image. No, because God knows the heart of the Canaanites. But will go to my land and my family to take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, suppose the woman is unwilling to follow me to this land. Should I have your son go back to the land you came from? Abraham answered him, make sure that you don't take my son back there. Wow, that's where you're going to get the wife from. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from my native land, who spoke to me and swore to me, I will give you this land to your offspring. He will send his angel before you, and you can take a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to follow you, then you are free from this oath to me. But don't let my son go back there. So the servant placed his hand under his master Abraham's thigh, swore an oath to him concerning this matter. When you go back and look at the end of chapter 22, there's a little short genealogy there about Abraham's brother Nahor and some of the other relatives. And there's a man mentioned in there by name, Bethuel. And Bethuel has a daughter named Rebekah. And at that time, we don't know, but as we read ahead, we say, oh, that's what the end of chapter 22 is there for. It's kind of like, beep, beep, there's what's coming. Just a little teaser, you know. This, you know, we do that on television. They show, this is what's coming in next week's episode. And that's good. Here's what's coming in a couple more chapters episode in doing this. And it gives a link that's essential to the next generation. When Abraham sacrificed the ram instead of Isaac, he was to safeguard his son and secure the future of God's promises. But in order for that promise to continue, Isaac must also marry and have descendants, and it's where they come from. There's some interesting things here, because he says, you don't get one of the daughters of the Canaanites. Well, should I take Isaac back there to you? No, you don't. If he goes back there, he'll probably stay there. He'll marry and they'll keep him there. Want him to come back here to this land God's given to the people. And yet, hundreds of years later, it's going to be interesting that one of the descendants is going to be from Rahab the harlot. And she's going to be like a great-great-great-grandmother of David. The genealogy stuff is really interesting, how God works all of that out. That's a whole different Bible study all on its own. Sometimes later, according to what the scriptures are saying, news comes to Abraham about his brother's family. Nahor and his wife have 8 sons. He has 4 more with his wife's concubine, total of 12. Each son is named. The last of Nahor's sons with his wife, Milcah, is named Bethuel, and then Rebekah. The narrator of the story is only interested in Rebekah. And the main reason he's interested in that is because of how it's going to come to play with Abraham and his descendants, that God has promised him will be like the sand of the seashore. It's, from what I understand, it's a typical Hebrew literary technique. But for me, it's a matter of saying, oh, now I see how God did things a little bit more. And there's just a couple of points. As much fun as it would be to study this whole chapter and look at everything that takes place here, Rebekah is the center point of this chapter. And how little God's providence is going to take her from where she's at, bring her into the plan that he has for the world for all time. Here's the point I want to emphasize. God didn't make her do this. He didn't program her to do that. Contrary to what Calvinism says. Calvinism says God marked them out and wasn't a thing they could do about it. Yeah, there was. Because the context tells us there's choices that can be made here. The next thing to notice is there's a spiritual response here. A spiritual response by Abraham. He follows God's word to a T. He's not going to settle for anything less. No, not from among the Canaanites. No, you don't take Isaac back there to find that wife. You go get her and bring her back here. There are so many people who spend so much time either trying to blame God for the choices they make in finding a spouse, or else try to figure in when a divorce comes about and say, well, it's part of God's plan for me. God never plans for people to do that. Our decisions determine our destiny. And we either go by what God wants according to his word, or we don't. And I'm not trying to judge anybody. I'm not. One of the big things we're lacking in our society today is accountability and responsibility. I look at a lot of things about why my children are doing what they, and I take accountability and responsibility. I should have done a better job as a father. So I don't make light of that idea. By the way, in verse 2 and verse 9, there's an interesting study there. It's about how serious this oath was. Place your hand under my thigh. Our ears are way too sensitive for a literal rendering. We couldn't take it, so I'm not going to get into it. I would suggest you look it up. This type of oath is only used twice in the Bible, once here and once in another place. It's never used in secular literature as far as I know. It doesn't seem to have been a common thing even in the Bible, but it does seem to have been confined to God's people, just like circumcision became something very unique among God's people. It's an interesting study. There are several places in the Bible where language is used and it's really blunt and clear, black and white, but we muddy up the water sometimes because our ears are too sensitive. I would just say go study this a little bit. You would find that rewarding. So there's a spiritual response by Abraham. And he makes his servant, who's over all of his property and stuff, his manager, makes him take an oath. I believe the servant is Eliezer. Can't prove it, but that's what most people seem to think. Eliezer was promised earlier when they didn't think there was going to be an inheritance of a son. Maybe it's going to be Eliezer. No, but Abraham put a lot of stock in Eliezer. And it's kind of interesting to notice what takes place here. Look at verse 12. Lord God of my master Abraham, he prayed, make this happen for me today and show kindness to my master Abraham. I am standing here at the spring where the daughters of the men of the town are coming out to draw water. Let the girl to whom I say, please lower your water jug so that I may drink, and who responds, drink, and I'll water your camels also, let her be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. It's really interesting because verse 12 says he prayed. I get the idea you don't hang around the house of Abraham very long without learning about prayer and how important it is. And when you look at the way he prayed, he's asking God for a sign. And it was given. But the sign was to do God's bidding. You would say, give me a sign, I'll know I need to do that. Well, most of the time people are looking for a sign to satisfy their own human needs. It's interesting, though, when you drop down to verse 48. I have to turn the page on this thing. Verse 48 says, then I knelt low, worshiped the Lord, blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who guided me on the right way to take the granddaughter of my master's brother for his son. And then in verse 51, Rebekah is here in front of you. Take her and go. Let her be a wife for your master's son, just as the Lord has spoken. From the beginning of that trip, all the way through and all the way back again, it's all done by pleasing God and doing it his way. I learned a phrase several years ago when I was at Netherwood. We talked about praying for things, ministries and stuff like that. And we talked about bathe it in prayer. I forgot who it was that used that phrase, but I love that phrase. Bathe it in prayer. Whatever it is you're looking to do, bathe it in prayer. Whether it's getting a new job, whether it's making a move, whether it's what school to go to, who to date, ministries, whatever it is, bathe it in prayer. And if we spent more time as God's people doing that, we'd be so much better off in this life. So much better off. We'd have a better quality of friends. We'd have a better quality of lifestyle when all's said and done. But it's interesting how how they're told to do that, and how he bathes it in prayer in verse 12. I want you to look a little bit at Isaac in verses 62 through 67, because the rest of the story is they go and they find her and meet the family and this and that, and give her the goods. It's interesting, though, that Laban stands out. You get a good look at Laban early. When he sees all the gifts that are brought out, Laban's like, oh yeah, I want to be tied in on this. This is my family. They're the ones that, I got a rich uncle somewhere over the promised land. See what I can get from that. But anyway, that's another story. But jot down to verse 62. Isaac was returning from Bir Lahai-roi, for he was living in the Negev region. I don't know, Jim. I have no idea how far it is to the Negev and all that. Have to check a map. In the early evening, Isaac went out to walk in the field, and looking up, he saw camels coming. I love this. This is so beautiful. Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she got down from her camel and asked the servant, "Who is that man in the field coming to meet us?" And the servant answered, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac everything that he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah and took Rebekah to be his wife. Isaac loved her, and he was comforted after his mother's death. Rebekah's coming back to take the expected role she should, replacing his mother. But now, like modern thinking tends to warp those things. She was to care for him. Mother was not there to do that anymore. It's leave and cleave. And I know a lot of young men who couldn't get away from mama, so being married didn't do them any good either. But they found love and security in each other. They shared the deep, undergirding knowledge that God had brought them together. And if they ever doubted anything about that, all they had to do was look back on the story of how they came together with God's help. And I think that's what's missing in too many of our Christian marriages today, especially when the Christian marries a non-Christian and they can't figure out why it went wrong. They had never dated before. They had never even met before. But there was a covenant that was agreed upon. They grew to love one another. It says that he loved her. They grow in their love for each other. They didn't fall in love. There was no accident. They let God choose for them, for one another, and their marriage was then on sure footing. My father-in-law years ago told me how he had told his daughters growing up, "If you don't marry a Christian, I'm not coming to the wedding." I talked to him about that some years ago, and he said, "Yeah, it was kind of harsh. I wish I hadn't been that strong." I said, "Well, personally, I'm kind of glad you did that because I got to marry her." And yet, to realize what's involved here is it's not a matter of love at first sight. It's a matter of growing to love one another. It's a matter of having a covenant. Can you imagine the stories that Isaac and Rebekah had to tell their children? Raise them by those stories. Did I ever tell you, son, about the time that your grandfather took me up to Mount Moriah? Yes, Dad, we've heard that story a lot. But tell it again. Tell you how I was, as it were, raised from the dead. Because I came back down the mountain God provided. Did we ever tell you the story about how your mother and I met? Yes, Dad, you've told us. Tell us again. Tell us again all those wonderful details. What was it like when you first saw her coming on that camel? What it was like for her when she first saw you out walking in the evening for prayer and meditation. I got to close here. I'm out of time, but I'm going to do it with 2 questions. This study left myself asking, I wonder if my kids even know my conversion story. It's a pretty cool story. I wonder if my kids even know how their mother and I really met. That's a pretty cool story. I've told both those stories in a lot of other areas. I'm trying to think if I've ever really told my kids. Don't know that I have. I promise you, when I see them in the next 4 or 5 months, different times, they will know both. They will know both. We're going to finish this up next week. And Lord willing, we're going to start in the last lesson and see what we can do with that one as well. That's all I've got for tonight. I'm told that we need to keep Raymond and his family in prayer because his family's homesick. He's not.
Raymond's not.
No,
But
Raymond's
both
not.
his kids are.
His
And
And
mom
his
and
parents
dad
are still sick.
Yes.
They're still homesick. And what else we got? You said there was
We have members traveling that we don't.
Yes,
if
we
we're
do have
on-
members traveling.
online, we don't want to-
This is true.
Yeah. Other than that, I don't know of anybody else, other than just our normal people. You know, that
We
we've
have
been,
more people?
that we've been, yeah, I know, just the ones we've been regularly praying for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think of anything good?
We've got, yeah.
Mike, anything you can think of? Jim? Anything we need to mention? Okay. Howard, would you lead us in prayer and we'll be
Sure.
dismissed?
Sure. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you so much for allowing us to come and meet with each other and study your word again. And we ask that we can open our hearts and our minds and understand these lessons and put them to use in our lives. Be with us as we leave here and help us to keep you in our minds and help us to make sure that we are on the path that we should be to you. Would help us to make the right decisions, say the right things, to be examples to others. We need you in our life, Lord, every single day. We have members that are traveling. This week we have members that are still sick and members that are healing, and we just want to offer these members up to you, Lord, to please bless them. You know who they are. We ask that you put your healing hand on those. Be with us as we leave here. Help us that we can be shining lights for those other people who are looking to find a way to be with you. Forgive us our sins, Lord, and we ask all this in your Son, Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Have a good evening, folks.